Have you ever wondered what it feels like to wake up with no urgent reason to get out of bed? Not because you're tired, but because nothing is required of you at all. Imagine morning light slipping gently through tall windows, filtered by curtains that cost more than most houses. The room is quiet in a particular way, not the quiet of emptiness, but the quiet of everything already being taken care of, somewhere beyond the walls. Footsteps move softly, deliberately, as other people begin the day on your behalf. This is America about 100 years ago, the early 1920s, a time that would later be called roaring, though mornings like this were anything but loud. The air inside these homes carried a faint mixture of polished wood, coal heat, maybe yesterday's cigar smoke lingering politely in the corners. Outside and cities were growing upward and outward, factories humming, radios crackling to life in ordinary living rooms. But here, at the very top of the economic ladder, the world felt buffered, padded, softened. A mainstream historical fact often repeated is that the American economy expanded rapidly after World War I, creating unprecedented fortunes for a small number of families. Industries grew, stock markets climbed, and new millionaires appeared almost overnight. Yet historians still argue whether this prosperity felt as solid and confident at the time as it looks in hindsight, or whether a quiet sense of imbalance already hovered in the background. For the filthy rich, money wasn't experienced as numbers, it was experienced as absence, the absence of waiting, the absence of uncertainty, the absence of needing to explain oneself. Breakfast did not involve decisions so much as expectations. Coffee appeared when it was usually wanted. Newspapers arrived folded just so. Headlines already a little stale by the time they reached these hands. The day stretched ahead, wide and undefined, shaped more by social obligations than by necessity. And yet, for all the extravagance we associate with the era, daily life at the top was often surprisingly restrained. There were rules, many of them. What to wear at certain hours, whom to acknowledge first in a room, how long one could linger at a table without appearing idle. Even leisure had structure, like a carefully arranged bouquet that must not look too deliberate. A small etude. Easily overlooked detail is that many wealthy Americans owned multiple homes not just for pleasure, but to escape discomfort. Summers were spent elsewhere to avoid heat, winters elsewhere to avoid damp. Comfort was mobile. Seasons became something to sidestep rather than endure. There's a gentle irony here. With all this freedom, life could become predictable. The same social calls, the same clubs, the same faces aging together year after year, like a private audience watching time pass from velvet seats. Some scholars still debate how aware the ultra-wealthy were of the vast inequality surrounding them. Did they feel insulated, genuinely believing prosperity would trickle downward, or did they sense quietly that their world rested on something fragile for now, though none of that presses in? The morning continues to unfold at its own unhurried pace. Outside, somewhere far below, streetcars rattle and shop doors open. Inside, a silver tray is set down without a sound. And being filthy rich, at least at the start of this story, feels less like excitement and more like floating. The day has begun. That floating feeling lingers for a while, the sense that time itself has loosened its grip. And as the day eases forward, attention drifts outward toward the place doing so much quiet work in the background, the house, the neighborhood, the carefully chosen piece of land beneath it all. Because being filthy rich 100 years ago wasn't only about having money. It was about where you positioned yourself in relation to everyone else. In the 1920s, America's wealthiest families arranged their lives geographically, almost like a slow dance with the seasons. Winters belonged to the city, tall townhouses lining wide avenues. Stone facades holding in warmth and discretion, summers meant escape, northward breezes, higher ground, long drives away from heat, smell, and noise. A mainstream historical fact is that many elite families maintained multiple residences, an urban home, a summer estate, sometimes even a winter retreat at a time when most Americans were lucky to have indoor plumbing. Historians still debate whether this pattern was driven more by comfort or by social pressure, since everyone at the top seemed to be going somewhere else. These neighborhoods were not accidental, they were curated. Entire enclaves rose almost overnight, designed to keep wealth clustered together like pearls on a string. Streets were wide, lawns expansive, and neighbors carefully vetted, often by bank balance alone. What's easy to miss is how quiet these places were. No shop fronts, no shouting, no rush. The silence itself became a signal. You didn't live here unless you had nothing to sell and nowhere you urgently needed to be. Inside the houses, scale did the talking. Ceilings stretched high enough to make voices behave. Staircases curved not for efficiency but for effect. Rooms were numerous enough that one could lose track of other people entirely, a luxury in itself. A small, often overlooked detail is how temperature shaped these spaces. Fireplaces burned even when they weren't strictly needed, just to keep air dry and steady. Windows were opened or shut by staff who understood drafts the way sailors understand wind. Comfort was calibrated, not guessed. And yet, despite all this grandeur, these homes were rarely cozy in the modern sense. Furniture was formal. Chairs invited posture more than relaxation. Sofas were arranged for conversation, not naps. Even rest had an audience in mind. There was also an unspoken map of prestige. One address carried more weight than another, even if the houses looked nearly identical. Proximity mattered to parks, to clubs, to other important people who could be casually visited without crossing town. Scholars still argue whether this constant clustering created a sense of safety or a sense of quiet competition. Did living among equals bring comfort, or did it turn every dinner party into a subtle comparison? As afternoon light shifts across polished floors, the house holds its breath. Outside, trimmed hedges form soft barriers between worlds. And within these boundaries, wealth becomes something solid, architectural, and reassuring. Not loud, not flashy, just firmly planted. And from here, from these carefully chosen places, the rhythms of daily life begin to take shape. That sense of being firmly planted settles in, and with it comes the soft realization that the house itself has already been awake for hours. Long before the wealthy owner stirs, the building has been stretching into the day. Doors open and close with practiced restraint. Curtains are adjusted just enough to let light in without letting the outside intrude. Somewhere below, a kettle is lifted, not because it was requested, but because it is expected. A mainstream historical fact often overlooked beneath the glamour is that large, wealthy households in the 1920s depended on extensive domestic staff. Even modestly rich families employed several workers, while the ultra-wealthy relied on small armies to keep daily life running smoothly. Historians still argue whether these homes functioned more like private residences or like finely tuned institutions. Upstairs, the morning unfolds slowly. There is no alarm clock, not the shrill kind anyway. Time arrives instead through habit. Light reaches a certain place on the wall. A distant sound signals movement below. The body wakes because it always has. A small but telling human detail is that many wealthy individuals did not dress themselves. Even for ordinary mornings, clothes were laid out the night before or selected by someone else entirely. Shirts warmed near radiators in winter, shoes weighted, already polished, as if standing at attention. Downstairs, the rhythm is different. Kitchens hum quietly. Floors are swept in patterns that will never be noticed. Conversations happen in whispers, more not out of secrecy, but out of training. Noise, like dust, is something to be managed. Domestic work in this era was rigidly structured. Cooks cooked, maids cleaned, butlers oversaw, chauffeurs waited. Each role had boundaries, and crossing them was considered improper, even if it meant inefficiency. Scholars still debate whether this strict hierarchy provided clarity or simply reinforced distance between people sharing the same roof. What's striking is how invisible all of this labor was meant to be. A successful morning was one in which nothing seemed to happen at all. Breakfast appeared. Rooms refreshed themselves. Objects returned to their places as if by magic. There's a gentle irony in this kind of abundance, just when everything works perfectly, it becomes easy to forget that anything is working at all. By late morning, the house settles into a pause. Tasks have been completed. The air smells faintly of soap and coffee. Somewhere upstairs, a newspaper is unfolded. Somewhere below, a staff member waits for the next cue, even if it won't come for hours. Historians still argue how much the wealthy notice these lives unfolding around them. Some accounts suggest genuine familiarity and long-term attachment. Others hint at polite distance maintained like an unwritten rule. For now, though, the house holds steady. Everything is ready, nothing is urgent, and with the day comfortably underway, attention begins to drift towards something even quieter, the way money itself moves, unseen, doing its work while everyone sleeps. The house remains calm, almost suspended in its own comfort. And somewhere within that stillness lies one of the great luxuries of being filthy rich 100 years ago, the peculiar knowledge that even while nothing happens, something is happening. Not in the kitchen, not in the halls, but quietly, elsewhere. A mainstream historical fact of the 1920s is that much of America's new wealth came from finance, industry, and investment rather than direct labor. Stocks, bonds, real estate, and trusts allowed fortunes to grow without their owners lifting anything heavier than a pen. Historians still debate how well many investors understood the systems enriching them, or whether confidence often stood in for comprehension. Money in this world had momentum. It moved through banks, partnerships, and paper agreements, multiplying gently while its owner read the paper or considered luncheon plans. For families with old money, this was nothing new. Wealth had long been something inherited, stewarded, and carefully protected from unnecessary effort. For the newly rich, however, there was a certain thrill to it. Bank statements arrived like quiet applause. Dividends felt like proof that one had arrived somewhere important. A small, easily missed detail is how physically distant this money often was, sir. Cash rarely appeared. Transactions happened through letters, telephone calls, or discreet meetings in offices far from the house. Wealth became abstract, which made it feel both limitless and strangely unreal. Trust funds were especially common. Children grew up knowing that at a certain age, income would simply begin not as a reward, but as a fact. Scholars still argue whether this created security or a lifelong sense of waiting for something already promised. And yet, even among the ultra-wealthy, there were rules. Talking openly about money was considered gauche. Asking direct questions about income was impolite. One demonstrated wealth not by explaining it, but by behaving as if it were irrelevant. There's a soft contradiction here. Money did all the work, yet one had to appear detached from it. Too much interest suggested insecurity. Too little attention risked foolishness. By midday, the machinery of finance continued humming far beyond the walls of the house. Offices downtown filled with men in dark suits. Phones rang. Papers were stamped. Meanwhile, the beneficiaries remained at leisure, vaguely aware that fortunes were being tended like gardens they never had to visit. Historians still debate how sustainable this arrangement felt in the moment. Did the wealthy sense that wealth based on speculation could evaporate? Or did the steady arrival of income lull them into believing the ground beneath them was solid? For now, the question doesn't intrude. The house is comfortable, the accounts are healthy, and the day drifts on, untroubled by effort. Soon enough, attention will turn outward again toward appearances, toward clothing, toward the subtle language of fabric and fit that spoke volumes before a single word was said. That outward turn happens almost without thinking. A glance toward the wardrobe, a quiet consideration of fabric, color, and our clothing in this world is never merely clothing. A mainstream historical fact is that fashion in the 1920s changed rapidly, especially among the wealthy, who could afford to follow and often set new trends each season. Designers like Coco Chanel and Jean Patou influenced silhouettes that favored movement and modernity, and affluent Americans eagerly adopted them. Historians still argue whether these changes reflected genuine freedom or simply new rules disguised as liberation. For wealthy women, the day began with choices that were anything but casual. Morning dresses were lighter, looser, meant for private spaces or informal calls. Afternoon outfits signaled readiness to be seen. Evening wear shimmered with silk, beads, and sequins, catching candlelight and attention in equal measure. A small but telling human detail is how carefully these garments were handled. Dresses were aired, not washed, whenever possible. Beadwork was checked stitch by stitch. A snag or loose thread could feel like a personal failure, even if no one else would ever notice. Men's clothing spoke in quieter tones. English tailoring was the gold standard. Wool suits during the day, softer collars for leisure, heavier coats for display. Innovations like Oxford bags and +4s made their way into wardrobes, offering ease while still signaling wealth. Comfort was permitted, but only if it looked intentional. Outerwear mattered enormously. Fur coats, especially, announced status before a word was spoken. On elite college campuses, young men wrapped themselves in raccoon coats that cost hundreds of dollars the price of signaling belonging. What's easy to miss is how physical these clothes were. Wool itched, shoes pinched, hats pressed down on carefully styled hair, yet discomfort was tolerated, even expected. Looking right mattered more than feeling at ease. There were also rules that hovered like polite ghosts. Colors for certain seasons, fabrics for certain hours. Violating them risked quiet judgment, the kind delivered through raised eyebrows and subtle pauses in conversation. Scholars still debate whether this constant attention to appearance created confidence or anxiety. Did dressing so carefully make one feel powerful, or perpetually on display by the time the mirror is satisfied? Posture adjusts automatically. Shoulders back, chin level, the body remembers what it represents, and once dressed, properly and purposefully. The day opens again, leading not just toward meals, but towards the careful performance of eating richly and carefully. Dressed and ready, the body becomes aware of something else, not hunger exactly, but the idea of it. The knowledge that food will arrive soon, prepared expertly, served elegantly, and judged quietly. A mainstream historical fact of the 1920s is that fine dining reached new heights among America's wealthy, especially in major cities and luxury hotels. French cuisine dominated elite menus, and meals became elaborate social rituals rather than simple nourishment. Historians still argue whether this abundance encouraged indulgence or sharpened anxiety about health and restraint. Meals were timed with precision. Breakfast might be light fruit, toast, coffee not out of necessity, but fashion. Lunches were often social, staged carefully in dining rooms that echoed softly with conversation and cutlery. Dinner was the main event, unfolding slowly across courses whose names were often spoken in French, whether fully understood or not. A small, quietly human detail is how often people worried about digestion. Rich food came with rich concerns. Complaints of heaviness, fatigue, or nerves were common, especially among those who ate well but moved little. Doctors advised moderation, fresh air, and walking recommendations received politely and sometimes ignored. Diet culture, surprisingly modern in tone, flourished. Calorie counting became fashionable. Reducing regimens were discussed in drawing rooms. Certain foods were praised one year and avoided the next. Scholars still debate whether these trends reflected genuine medical advances or simply new ways to exert control in a life already cushioned from hardship. Even indulgence had its limits. Portions were often smaller than expected. Presentation mattered more than quantity. The goal was to appear refined, not ravenous. There's a gentle contradiction here, too. Wealth made everything available, yet restraint became a virtue. To eat too eagerly suggested insecurity. To decline delicately signaled discipline. Dining rooms themselves reinforced this performance. Chairs encouraged upright posture. Conversation flowed in measured turns. Servers moved silently, refilling glasses before they appeared empty. Success was when no one noticed the work at all. Historians still argue how satisfying this kind of eating truly was. Did luxury enhance pleasure, or did constant self-monitoring dull it as the meal ends? Plates are cleared almost before the last bite fades. The body feels full, but not heavy, satisfied, but alert. And soon, attention drifts beyond the table toward movement, toward travel, toward the ease with which the wealthy could go, anywhere at all. That satisfied stillness after a meal doesn't last long, not because anything is wrong, only because movement is always an option. For the filthy rich of the 1920s, travel carried none of the rough edges most people accepted as normal. No standing in lines that mattered, no shared benches, no clocks consulted with urgency. The journey itself was simply another extension of comfort. A mainstream historical fact is that luxury travel expanded rapidly during this period, especially through first-class rail cars and transatlantic ocean liners, where wealthy passengers experience levels of service designed to insulate them completely from inconvenience. Historians still debate whether these environments fostered genuine relaxation or simply relocated social pressure into more ornate surroundings. Packing was almost ceremonial. Trunks were arranged days in advance, lined carefully, labeled discreetly. Clothing was chosen not just for destination, but for the journey itself. One dressed properly to be seen departing. A small, easily overlooked human detail is that wealthy travelers often brought familiar objects with them: pillows, framed photographs, even specific brands of soap to recreate a sense of home wherever they went. Comfort, for them, was portable, on trains. First-class cars felt hushed, padded, almost cocooned, seats reclined gently. Windows framed the countryside like moving paintings. Attendants anticipated needs before they were spoken. Motion became soothing rather than tiring. At sea, the experience grew even softer. Cabins were spacious. Meals arrived on porcelain. Conversations drifted lazily across decks as the ocean slipped by without demanding attention. One could cross an entire ocean and arrive feeling essentially unchanged. What's striking is how little friction shaped perception. Distance lost meaning. Time zones became minor inconveniences. The world felt smaller, smoother, and more cooperative. Scholars still argue whether this ease contributed to a sense of detachment. Did constant comfort dull awareness of how others traveled, or did it simply reinforce the belief that this was how the world ought to function? By the time luggage was unpacked at the destination, often by someone else, the journey itself was already fading from memory. Travel wasn't something endured. It was something that happened around you. And wherever the wealthy arrived, another quiet certainty followed. Even the rules that applied elsewhere would soften here too. That sense of the world softening wherever you arrive extends naturally into rules, especially the ones meant to apply to everyone. By the early 1920s, prohibition was the law of the land in the United States, and the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol were officially banned. It's a mainstream historical fact taught early and often. Yet historians still argue about how dry the country ever truly became, particularly at the very top. Inside wealthy homes, the change was almost cosmetic. Cabinets remained, glassware stayed polished, bottles simply became quieter. Alcohol did not vanish. It relocated into private clubs, private dining rooms, and private understandings. Invitations mattered more than addresses. A small, revealing human detail is how quality itself became a marker of privilege. While ordinary drinkers often encountered harsh, unreliable bootleg liquor, the wealthy enjoyed well-aged spirits, imported wines, and carefully mixed cocktails prepared by people who knew exactly what they were doing. Prohibition, in practice, widened the sensory gap between classes. Drinking also changed how it was done. Beer, once common, was quietly sidelined. It carried associations with working-class saloons and pre-war immigrant culture. Distilled spirits and cocktails took center stage, compact, elegant, easier to conceal, and far more fashionable. Conversation flowed differently with a drink in hand. Voices lowered, laughter softened. The act itself felt faintly conspiratorial, though rarely dangerous. Rules were technically broken, but with such regularity that they felt more like traditions waiting for legal recognition. Scholars still debate whether the wealthy viewed prohibition as hypocrisy or inconvenience. Some accounts suggest genuine amusement at the idea of laws meant for other people. Others hint at mild irritation, another social obstacle to navigate with grace. What's certain is that alcohol became part of social choreography. One drank discreetly, one never appeared drunk. To lose control was to lose status. As evening deepened, glasses were refilled without comment. No one spoke of where the liquor came from. Questions, like bottles, were not left out in the open. And when the night ended, the house returned to stillness. Rules once again bending themselves around comfort. With spirits fading gently from the senses, attention turned toward something equally structured, equally performative: leisure itself, and the curious obligation to enjoy it properly. As the evening settles and glasses are quietly cleared away, something else remains: the gentle pressure to do something enjoyable. Not because one wants to, necessarily, but because that is what is expected. For the filthy rich of the 1920s, leisure was not empty time. It was scheduled, organized, and subtly judged. A mainstream historical fact is that elite social calendars were filled with club events, sporting engagements, private dances, and seasonal rituals that structured life as firmly as work structured everyone else's. Historians still debate whether this abundance of leisure produced freedom or simply replaced labor with obligation. Country clubs anchored much of this world. Golf, tennis, and riding were favored not just for recreation, but for visibility. One played to be seen playing. Skill mattered less than presence, and presence mattered less than belonging. A small, often unnoticed human detail is how tiring this could be. Multiple costume changes in a day, travel between engagements, polite conversation repeated with different faces. Leisure demanded stamina. Private parties followed strict unspoken rules. Guest lists were curated carefully. Seating arrangements conveyed subtle messages. Music was chosen to signal taste, not provoke enthusiasm. Enjoyment was meant to appear effortless, even when it required careful management. There was also an expectation of participation. Declining too often suggested aloofness. Attending without enthusiasm suggested boredom, perhaps the gravest social sin. One had to seem pleasantly occupied, never restless, never overwhelmed. Scholars still argue whether the wealthy truly enjoyed these routines or simply tolerated them as the price of status. Diaries from the era sometimes hint at relief when events were canceled, even as public disappointment was expressed. Sports offered a socially acceptable outlet for exertion, hunting trips, sailing, and weekend excursions allowed controlled displays of vigor. Even these, however, followed etiquette. One did not sweat too visibly, one did not try too hard. As nights stretched long and mornings followed quickly, leisure became a kind of quiet work, unpaid, unacknowledged, but relentless. And within these rituals, roles were reinforced, expectations sharpened. Nowhere was this more evident than in how women of wealth were expected to move, appear, and be seen. That quiet labor of leisure settles differently depending on who is performing it. And for wealthy women in the 1920s, Homer, the expectations arrived early and stayed late. A mainstream historical fact is that elite women were central to the social machinery of the era. While men's status was often tied to finance or industry, women's standing was displayed through appearance, hosting, marriage, and visibility at the right events. Historians still debate how much agency this afforded women and how much it confined them within beautifully decorated boundaries. Mornings often began with preparation rather than productivity. Hair arranged just so, dresses selected with the day's social demands in mind, the mirror became a kind of quiet supervisor, reminding one of posture, expression, restraint. A small, easily missed human detail is how much waiting filled these days. Waiting for callers, waiting for letters, waiting for plans made by others to unfold. Time passed gently, but not always meaningfully. Young women, especially, moved through a carefully staged path. Debutante balls marked their formal entry into society. Grand evenings where white dresses, gloves, and polite smiles signaled readiness for adulthood, and more pointedly, for marriage. Newspapers reported on these events with enthusiasm, turning private lives into public curiosities. Marriage itself was rarely framed as romance alone. It was alignment. Families watched carefully. Prospects were evaluated quietly. Affection might grow later, or not. Scholars still argue how often these unions felt like partnerships versus performances maintained for appearances. Fashion offered both expression and limitation. Shorter hemlines and simpler silhouettes suggested freedom. Yet the scrutiny intensified. A woman could be modern, but not careless. Stylish, but not loud. Independent, but not threatening. Even leisure came with expectations. Dancing was encouraged. Drinking required moderation. Laughter needed to sound natural, never strained. To misstep socially was to risk being discussed softly, but thoroughly. And yet, within these constraints, women found small freedom, friendships, private jokes, quiet rebellions in fabric choice or timing, a cigarette smoked just a bit too confidently. A rule bent, not broken. Historians still debate whether these gestures amounted to change or merely adaptation. But within the rooms where music played and lights glowed warmly, something subtle was shifting. As the night wound down and expectations were once again met, attention turned elsewhere toward the men who carried power differently, and the weight that came with appearing effortlessly in control. That subtle shift in the room carries on, moving from silk and laughter toward darker fabrics and quieter voices. The men of wealth inhabit the same spaces, but the expectations placed upon them settle in a different way, heavier, perhaps, though no less carefully arranged. A mainstream historical fact is that elite men in the 1920s were expected to embody stability and authority. Their identities were tied to business success, family reputation, and visible self-control. Historians still debate whether this ideal produced confidence or a constant low-grade tension beneath the polished surface. Mornings for these men often involved reading financial pages long before speaking to anyone. Markets were checked, letters reviewed, phone calls placed from studies that smelled faintly of leather and tobacco. Even leisure was bracketed by awareness of money's movements. A small, overlooked human detail is how rarely uncertainty was admitted. Worry existed, of course, but it lived behind closed doors. Publicly, one projected ease. Decisions were delivered calmly, even when privately debated for hours. Clothing reinforced this posture. Suits were structured, shoulders squared, lines clean. Hats were worn not for warmth, but for completeness. To be improperly dressed suggested carelessness, a dangerous signal in a world where reputation was currency. Social interactions followed similar rules. Men spoke confidently even when unsure. They listened just enough. Silence could be powerful if used correctly. Over-explaining, on the other hand, hinted at weakness. Scholars still argue how much emotional labor this required. Letters and diaries sometimes reveal exhaustion, the effort of maintaining composure, of never appearing impressed, surprised, or overwhelmed. Power had to look natural, or it didn't count. Even recreation carried expectations. Sports allowed controlled expressions of vigor, but losing badly or trying too hard both carried risks. One had to appear competitive without appearing desperate. At home, authority was assumed rather than asserted. Decisions seemed to make themselves. Staff responded promptly. Family routines bent subtly around these expectations. And yet, beneath the confidence, there were questions about markets, about legacy, about whether success could be maintained indefinitely. These questions rarely surfaced aloud, but they hovered quietly, like distant weather. As night settled and conversations slowed, respectability remained intact, for now. But beyond the visible power of these men existed another reality entirely, the lives of those who made this world function, often unseen and always essential. That polished confidence, so carefully maintained, rests on something softer and far more complex beneath it, a web of lives moving quietly through hallways, staircases, and back doors. The wealthy household of the 1920s was never truly empty. It was animated constantly by people whose presence was meant to be unnoticed. A mainstream historical fact is that domestic service was one of the largest categories of employment in the United States at the time, especially for women and people of color. Historians still debate whether this work offered opportunity or simply reinforced long-standing hierarchies. Early mornings began downstairs, fires lit, floors swept, breakfast prepared before anyone upstairs stirred. The rhythm was precise. Learned through repetition rather than instruction, each task had its place, each person their lane. A small human detail often overlooked is how well staff learned the habits of the household, which door creaked, which cup was preferred, which moods required silence. This knowledge wasn't written down. It was absorbed slowly, like learning a language without realizing it. Roles were rigidly defined. Cooks rarely crossed into dining rooms. Maids avoided studies. Butlers mediated everything, translating the needs of the family into motion without revealing effort. Crossing these boundaries was considered improper, even if intentions were good. For many workers, especially African Americans and immigrant women, domestic service offered steady employment when other options were scarce, yet protections were minimal. There was no minimum wage, hours stretched long, live-in staff, in particular, found work and life merging into something without clear edges. scholars still debate how personal these relationships truly were. Some households fostered loyalty that lasted decades. Others maintained distance so formal it bordered on invisibility. Affection existed, but it was carefully contained. What's striking is how rarely these lives appear in photographs of wealth. Grand rooms are captured spotless and still, as if no one had ever passed through them. The labor that made such calm possible disappears the moment it succeeds. At the end of the day, staff retreated quietly, often to modest quarters or separate homes. Their worlds shifted back into focus as the wealthy household settled into rest, unaware or only vaguely aware of the transition. And yet, without these people, nothing would have functioned. No meals, no schedules, no illusion of ease. As the house grows quiet once more, another kind of visibility begins to matter: how wealth is seen from the outside. Written about, admired, and quietly mocked. That quiet retreat of the household staff leaves behind a different kind of presence, not physical, but perceptual. The sense of being observed, even when alone. By the 1920s, wealth was no longer private in the way it once had been. A mainstream historical fact is that newspapers and magazines devoted entire sections to society news, tracking the movements, parties, and wardrobes of the ultra-wealthy with steady fascination. Historians still debate whether this attention flattered the rich or slowly eroded their sense of privacy. Morning papers carried more than headlines. They carried names, photographs, carefully chosen descriptions of gowns, guest lists, and charitable appearances. To appear in print was both confirmation and risk. Being mentioned meant relevance. Being mentioned too often invited scrutiny. A small, telling human detail is how many wealthy households clipped these articles and saved them. Scrapbooks filled quietly with evidence of having been seen, proof that one existed properly within the social record. Writers and cartoonists, meanwhile, sharpened their pens. Satire flourished. The complaints of the rich about service, inconvenience, or boredom became material for gentle ridicule. The tone was rarely angry. It was amused, and that, perhaps, was more unsettling. F. Scott Fitzgerald famously moved through this world as both participant and observer, describing the decade as extravagantly beautiful and faintly hollow. Scholars still debate whether his writing reflected resentment, admiration, or a careful blend of both. What mattered was that the wealthy were no longer just living their lives. They were performing them for an audience they would never meet. Even solitude felt public, in a way. This awareness shaped behavior. Charity became visible. Taste became performative. Even modesty could be staged. One learned to manage one's image as carefully as one's investments. As evening returned and lights glowed behind drawn curtains, the outside world faded again. But the knowledge lingered that somewhere, someone was watching, or writing, or quietly smiling. And with that awareness came another impulse entirely: the desire to be remembered kindly, permanently, through gestures that reached beyond the present moment. That lingering awareness of being watched softens into something quieter, more reflective. If one is already being noticed, the thought follows naturally: for what? Exactly. For the filthy rich of the 1920s. Philanthropy offered an answer that felt both generous and reassuring. A mainstream historical fact is that many wealthy families funded universities, museums, hospitals, and scientific research during this period, often through foundations bearing their own names. Historians still debate how much of this giving was driven by altruism, and how much by a desire for permanence. Charity, at this level, was rarely anonymous. Names were carved into stone, plaques appeared in entryways, endowments carried family identities forward, long after individual lives had quieted. Giving wasn't only about helping, it was about remaining. A small, easily missed human detail is how formal these acts could feel. Donations were discussed in letters and boardrooms, not living rooms. Amounts were calculated carefully. Impact was considered, but so was visibility. One didn't simply give, one established. Supporting the arts carried particular appeal. Paintings, orchestras, libraries, these suggested refinement and foresight. Funding science hinted at modernity and progress. Scholars still argue whether these choices reflected genuine curiosity or a careful reading of public taste. There was comfort in this process. Money. Once abstract and constantly moving, became fixed into buildings and institutions, something solid, something that would outlast markets. At social gatherings, philanthropy slipped easily into conversation, not as boasting. Exactly, that would have been impolite but as gentle acknowledgement. A hospital wing here, a scholarship fund there, enough to be known without appearing eager. And yet, beneath the generosity, a quiet anxiety sometimes surfaced. Would the gift be remembered? Would the name endure? Would future generations understand the intention? As night deepened and conversations drifted towards softer topics, the idea of legacy lingered like a low lamp left on in an empty room, comforting, but faintly unsettling. Because once thoughts turn toward permanence, it becomes harder to ignore the possibility that even the strongest foundations rest on shifting ground. And somewhere, beyond the glow of philanthropy and good intentions, small cracks were beginning to form, subtle enough to be dismissed. If one preferred not to look too closely, that low lamp of legacy thinking casts longer shadows now. Not dramatic ones, nothing so impolite, but faint irregularities at the edges of an otherwise perfect room. By the late 1920s, a mainstream historical fact is that the American economy appeared extraordinarily strong on the surface. Stock prices climbed steadily, consumer confidence was high, and newspapers spoke confidently of continued prosperity. Historians still argue whether warning signs were visible enough to be recognized, or whether optimism simply drowned them out. Among the wealthy, conversation rarely turned openly toward concern. Doing so would have felt awkward, almost ungrateful. After all, portfolios were performing well. Dividends arrived on time, houses remained full, staffed, and warm, yet small changes crept in. A subtle human detail sometimes mentioned in letters from the period is a new attentiveness to numbers. Men lingered slightly longer over financial pages. Phone calls ran a bit later than usual. There was no panic, just an extra pause before hanging up. Some social events grew more restrained, not canceled exactly, but simplified. A dinner with fewer courses, a party that ended earlier than expected. Nothing anyone could point to and say, "This is different." Yet something felt measured. Speculation had become ordinary. Investing was no longer confined to quiet offices. It was discussed at lunches and clubs. Even those who didn't fully understand the mechanisms felt reassured by the steady upward movement. Confidence itself became contagious. Scholars still debate how insulated the ultra-wealthy truly were from risk. Many believed their advisors would see danger coming long before it reached them. Others assumed that even if trouble arrived, it would be manageable, absorbed quietly, like a draft corrected by closing a door. There was also a psychological comfort in precedent. Fortunes had risen before, crises had been survived. History, it was assumed, moved in cycles that favored those already established. As autumn approached, routines continued uninterrupted. Houses prepared for winter, social calendars filled, investments rolled forward with gentle momentum, and yet, beneath the smooth surface, pressure was building not explosively, but patiently, like weight accumulating on a structure designed for permanence, but not necessarily for surprise. The wealthy slept well during this time, perhaps because they slept well. And when the break finally came, it would arrive not as a gradual dimming, but as a sudden, unmistakable silence where motion had always been. That silence doesn't arrive all at once either. At first, it sounds like confusion. A mainstream historical fact is that in October of 1929, stock prices collapsed rapidly, erasing enormous amounts of paper wealth in a matter of days. Newspapers would later call it a crash. At the time, many experienced it more like a stutter, a hesitation in a rhythm that had always carried on. Telephones rang earlier in the morning, conversations shortened, familiar voices carried unfamiliar edges. The numbers on pages no longer moved in reassuring directions, and for the first time in years, they demanded attention. A small, quietly human detail appears in memoirs from the period people continued with their plans anyway. Dinners were attended, clothes were worn, appointments kept. The habit of normalcy was strong, and no one wanted to be the first to act as though something irreversible had happened. Inside wealthy homes, staff noticed the shift before guests did. Meals grew simpler. Instructions became more precise. There was less improvisation, more checking. The house still functioned, but the air felt alert. Historians still argue how much the wealthy understood in those first weeks. Some believed it was temporary, a correction, nothing more. Others sensed immediately that something fundamental had changed, though they struggled to articulate what that meant. Markets closed, reopened, fell again. The language around money grew cautious, then strained. Words like confidence and patience appeared frequently, as if repetition might summon them back into existence. What's striking is how quickly the tone of leisure changed. Invitations slowed. Travel plans were postponed just for now. There was no announcement, no dramatic declaration, simply a collective pulling inward. Even so, denial lingered. Fortunes had survived shocks before. Surely this would pass as well. As days turned into weeks, the music that had filled the decade seemed to lower in volume. Not stopped, just quieter, uncertain of its next note. And in that quiet, something deeply unfamiliar began to surface. For the very wealthy, the feeling of not knowing what came next. The lights were still on. The houses still stood. But the rhythm that had carried everything so effortlessly was gone. And once that rhythm disappeared, the world that followed would feel very different indeed. That missing rhythm leaves behind a peculiar stillness heavier than silence because it's filled with memory. In the months and years that followed the crash, a mainstream historical fact is that even some of America's wealthiest individuals saw their fortunes collapse entirely. Businesses failed, investments evaporated, credit tightened. Historians still debate how many of these losses were inevitable and how many were the result of decisions made under pressure and disbelief. For those who had always lived at the top, the change was disorienting. Not always immediately catastrophic, the houses did not vanish overnight, but gradual. Like realizing the floor is lower than it used to be. A small, deeply human detail appears again and again in personal accounts. Routines remained, even when the reason for them had disappeared. People woke at the same hour, dressed the same way, read the same papers. Habit lingered long after certainty had left. Some households quietly reduced staff, a gardener let go, a second maid dismissed with polite regret, rooms closed off to save heat. These changes were framed as temporary even when they weren't. Identity proved harder to manage than finances, for men whose sense of self had been tied to success. The loss felt strangely physical. For women whose social worlds depended on hosting and visibility, invitations slowed, then stopped. The calendar once full grew blank in unsettling ways. Scholars still argue how much shame accompanied this shift. Publicly, dignity was maintained. Privately, letters hint at embarrassment, confusion, and a kind of grief that didn't know where to settle. Some former millionaires attempted comebacks, others withdrew entirely. A few adapted with surprising ease, discovering that life without constant performance felt lighter. But these stories were the exception, not the rule. What lingered most was uncertainty, Aisher. Without money smoothing every surface, the world felt sharper. Decisions mattered again. Consequences returned. As years passed, some names faded from society pages altogether. Houses were sold, possessions dispersed, and the idea of being filthy rich lost its sheen, replaced by something quieter and more cautious. Yet even as fortunes dissolved, traces remained in habits, in expectations, in the way certain people still carried themselves as if wealth might return at any moment. And from those traces, a question emerged that would outlast the decade itself. What, exactly, had all that wealth been for? That answer would take longer to form, stretching beyond the 1920s, beyond the crash, and into the shape of the modern world that followed. That question lingers softly, long after the noise of the decade has faded, not demanding an answer, just waiting. A mainstream historical fact is that the economic collapse of the 1930s reshaped American attitudes toward wealth, risk, and regulation, leaving a lasting imprint on how prosperity is pursued and perceived. Historians still debate whether the excesses of the 1920s were a necessary experiment or a cautionary tale written too loudly to ignore. What remained of the filthy rich era was not only memory, but habit. Certain ways of living endured seasonal migration, elite neighborhoods, private clubs, the quiet language of status conveyed through clothing and restraint. Luxury became more discreet, but no less intentional. A small, almost tender human detail is how objects outlived their owners. Crystal glasses still caught the light. Staircases still curved gracefully. Buildings funded by once great fortunes continued to welcome visitors who rarely knew the full story behind the names engraved in stone. The culture learned something subtle. Wealth was no longer assumed to be permanent. Fortunes could rise and fall. Security, it turned out, was something even the richest had borrowed from the future. Scholars still argue whether this realization created humility or simply caution. In time, new fortunes emerged, new cycles began. But the memory of sudden loss lingered like a faint echo beneath every boom that followed. Being filthy rich, as it was lived 100 years ago, offered comfort, insulation, and beauty. It also demanded performance, restraint, and faith in systems that were never entirely visible. Perhaps the greatest legacy of that era is not the extravagance we remember, but the quiet understanding that money can shape the texture of daily life, smoothing some edges, sharpening others without ever fully answering the deeper questions it raises. As the lights dim on this story, what remains is a calm awareness of rooms once filled, of routines carefully kept, of a world that floated until it didn't. And somewhere in that memory, a gentle reminder drifts forward even at the very top. Life was still made of ordinary moments, passing quietly, one after another.